Thanks a lot, Robert. This is a great seminar, so happy to speak. And I suppose the topic for me today will be two projects. Both of them were funded through the Department of Justice here in Montana, the Natural Resource Damage Program. And so Robert asked me to speak about Lower Area 1, and we've had now two projects at Lower Area 1, so I'll summarize those two. The first part is on the slag itself, and the second part is on the sediment in the creek and how it interacts with the creek water. So, okay, we'll get into this, and most of the work I'm presenting is the work of two grad students, Jenna, who finished in 2016, did the work on the slag, and Bob Rader, who many of you know because he's now working for Copper in Anaconda, Copper Environmental, finished just this year. He did the Peeper work. All right, now, some of you have had this before, but some of you probably don't really have a good idea on what slag is, and I'm going to pass this slag rock around. And it's man-made lava. But first you have to back up and go, okay, so where'd it come from? It came out of a smelter. In this case, the smelter was the Butte Reduction Works smelter, owned by Marcus Daly and all them. And so you have a hot furnace here, and into this furnace you put the concentrated ore. So the boronite and the chalcopyrite that has all your copper in it, and also other things that go in along with it, like sphalerite and other metals. And then in the hot furnace, it melts the rock. And to help it to melt, you add this flux. And the flux is simply, sometimes they add calcium carbonate, like limestone, crushed limestone. Sometimes they add crushed quartz. And so some of the big quarries you see on the road, for no apparent reason, there's a big quarry on the hillside. Sometimes they were quarrying limestone for flux or quartz for flux. And they add that, and the reason they did that was two things. It lowered the melting temperature of the ore, and it helped to separate the copper from the other elements like silica that is waste. Now, when the rock melts, it doesn't make a single melt. It makes two melts. The heavier, denser melt has the copper in it. But it's not pure copper. It's actually copper sulfide, and I'll show you pictures of this stuff. The first round of smelting produces a copper, like a pure copper sulfide product. And that stuff's called a matte. And then the slag is all of the, like the quartz and the, other feldspar and biotite and stuff that's in the rock that you want to get. You want to separate that stuff from the molten copper melt. So that stuff is less dense. It kind of separates from the more dense matte and forms a crust on top. It's a molten crust on top, or a layer. And they skim that off and in buckets, and then they would wheel the buckets out and pour them, and the slag would harden, and now we have slag. Okay. And then another thing that, of course, the sulfur in the sulfides, a lot of the sulfur then goes up the chimney. And back in the day, there would have been a lot of acid rain from the SO2 coming out of the smelters in Butte. But also, a lot of arsenic would have been volatilized back then into arsenic trioxide. And also, I didn't know this until Courtney pointed out, a lot of zinc probably went up as a gas as well. And so, anywhere here as well as in Anaconda, just about any soil that hasn't been reclaimed or remediated is contaminated with zinc and arsenic. Okay, subtypes of slag, and we've got a big, huge pile of sandy slag over in Anaconda. That's the Washoe smelter, and so, but that is different than what I'm talking about. So this slag was rapidly cooled with a jet of water and made little tiny drop, like sand-sized glass spheres. And then this is how it might look, and then just mountains of this stuff. And for whatever reason, in the old days they did more of the slow air cooling and then they shifted over to the water cooling. So with the air cooling, you have the molten slag, and it's probably around 800,000 degrees centigrade, and it's basically like lava, like basalt lava. And then you pour it into a mold, and it hardens into these layers. And because it cools more slowly, it probably takes days or weeks to cool, there's time for crystals to grow. So it's not glass. Glass means amorphous, no crystals. And as I said, it's similar to basalt lava. So we'll look at this stuff. Where do we have slag? So this is the Butte Reduction Works slag walls, and you've all seen them along Montana Street, where it crosses the creek, where the creek crosses underneath. You have the slag walls on both sides of the creek, and so that's what's remaining. I think there's probably more slag that got taken away. And then over here in the Parrot area, we've got a lot of buried slag. Now, one of the things about this project and why we did it early on is that, Silverbow Creek and Blacktail Creek come together here and move right through the slag wall. So we wanted to know more about the slag. Is it leachable? And this is how they used to do it. So this is actually at BRW slag wall. So if you look carefully, these people here, there's probably a train track here, just a rail that you could push these things out on. And you can see two big buckets, and they're decanting the lava into like a basin, a tub, if you will. And then sometimes that was made by like wood, pieces of wood. And then the wood would slowly burn away from the heat, and you'd have this slag sitting there. And this is how it looks now. So when the reclamation was done in the 90s in this area of Lower Area 1, the decision was made to leave these slag walls in place. And for a couple of reasons. And one was they had, was felt historical significance. And so they're like monuments to the day when Butte was super industrial and lots of copper being produced. And secondly, they were thought to be chemically inert and therefore not a hazard. And thirdly, they could save some money by not removing them. And so, but is the slag really inert? So that's the question we wanted to tackle, and we wanted to remind ourselves what the ore was like that went into the furnaces back then. Is very complex ore, not just copper. You had copper, zinc, lead, moly, manganese, silver, tungsten, etc. All minerals, long mineral list going into this thing. And so the slag is probably complex as well. So Jenna did this, and we were allowed to go collect samples, not difficult, and then look at their chemistry, look at the mineralogy, because we're geologists. We want to see the mineralogy of, like in thin section. We did some acid-base counting, I'll explain that, and some leaching tests. So the leaching tests we did were like EPA leaching tests. One is you use synthetic precipitation, so basically rain that has a little bit of acidity in it, rainwater, and then that's called SPLP. And then TCLP is what they use to decide if a solid waste is toxic waste or not, and it's a strong, like organic acid type leach. Okay, so we'll get into it a little bit. First thing we did, because I have our department has the XRF and X-ray fluorescence meter, and so it's actually pretty accurate for this type work. And you can just shine it on the slag wherever it went. And this data were collected by the XRF. Later we got data that was done better. But and then you look at the weight percent composition, and this stuff is, sure enough, is rich in metals. Now most of the slag is like iron, 40–50%, calcium, silica. But then you've got several percent of zinc, almost an ore body, and then hundreds to thousands of ppm of some nasty elements like copper, lead, and arsenic. So definitely metal in the slag. And now, as I say, we like to zoom in to a microscopic scale. So now we're looking at two things. These are scanning electron microscope images. Okay, so these were probably taken at Gary Weiss's SEM in the Mineralogy department. And then these are thin section photographs. So if you slice any rock thin enough, light will pass through the non-metallic minerals, and you can see their colors and stuff under the microscope. Okay, so anyway, there's a lot to see in this slag. It's not just boring. I won't go through all the details. The main minerals in here, turns out, are olivine, an iron olivine, an iron calcium pyroxene, and another pyroxene that's mainly calcium. And there's a lot of iron oxide in the form of magnetite, and there's some glass. So like where you see the bright white here, it's not a hole, it's a glass, amorphous solid. And then you can see how these sort of spheres of like feathery crystals grew as the slag was cooling, grew and formed these aggregates here. They actually nucleated around these little dots that I'll talk about in a minute. So cool stuff. Some of the crystals are quite large. You can see them with your eye. Most of them are fine grain. Now, when you hit these things with the SEM or electron microprobe, you'd be surprised to find that these are not normal compositions. So this pyroxene has like 5% of zinc in it and really high copper. So even though they're ordinary minerals, they are potential to release metals. Now, the copper likes to form its own phases, and in this case, what was really cool was we'd see these spheres. And these are now in under the microscope. If you polish up a surface and reflect light down, it will strike the surface, and if there's reflective minerals, it'll come back. And so you're seeing the reflected light, and actually true color. The yellow here is chalcopyrite, the pinkish is bornite, sort of in here, and then the blue, light blue is chalcocite. Those are all copper minerals, copper sulfides. And what you're seeing are little what were once droplets of this matte, the copper-rich melt. And they didn't separate, so they should have sunk through the slag and joined the rest of the matte, but for whatever reason they too small, or the slag crystallized around it and they couldn't, so they formed their own little spheroids. Okay, they call these things prills, and they're cool. You see these cool exsolution textures and really neat stuff, so we kind of flipped out at that. Sometimes you see native copper in there, elemental copper, elemental silver we've seen, and all kinds of cool stuff. So that's what's the slag. Now then you can say, well, from a purely, will this stuff generate acid if it weathers? Or will it not generate acid? That's what's known as acid-base accounting. And so you send your rock, you could just take a rock, put it in a bag, and send it to the lab. It's not that expensive, maybe 50 bucks. And what they'll do is two different tests, and they'll figure out how much acid-generating potential that rock has, usually in the form of pyrite. And it'll also determine how much acid neutralizing potential the rock has. So they crush it up into a powder, and then they might hit it with some acid and have it react for 24 hours and then see how much got neutralized by the rock. That's called acid-base accounting. So you can do that with any rock. And it's a common thing to do around mine waste. So I won't go into the details of how the graph was constructed. The bottom line is that probably this slag is not going to generate acid. It doesn't have very much pyrite or sulfides. I mean, I showed you these prills. I showed you these, but you can't see this with your eye. This is only 100 microns across, so they're really small. And but more than that, these minerals like olivine, pyroxene, they react pretty fast, and they'll neutralize acid, just like if you're familiar with the Stillwater mine in our big platinum palladium mine in Columbus. You know, it doesn't generate acid, even though there's a couple % sulfides in the ore in the JM reef. And it's because the minerals that it's in include olivine and pyroxene and things that can react away and neutralize that acid. All right, anyway. Okay, so it's not going to make acid, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to release metals. It could still release some metals through weathering of these prills. So here's where we slice the rock and then polish it up and look at it. We can see that this particular prill has cracks in it and it's starting to weather away. And we hit this with the SEM, and these are copper sulfates, which are very soluble. So we go, oh, well, this would definitely, if water got in here, would definitely dissolve and go into the environment. So we did leaching tests, and I think Jenna did these over in the bureau, actually, because they have a setup. This isn't their setup, but you get the idea. And the synthetic precip, so you hit it with basically rainwater, and then you react it for a certain amount of time, and then you see what you get. So the pHs were all really high, 8 or 9. That's consistent with what we were saying about these minerals, olivine and stuff. So that's not a problem. And then if you look at the metals, they're all actually pretty low. Really low: copper, lead, zinc, and cadmium. And you wouldn't necessarily drink this water, but in terms of a SPLP of mine waste, this is pretty inert compared to what other stuff in Butte. But there are some, and for example, arsenic is you would be that raises some concern there. The arsenic levels are pretty high. It feels hot in here. Okay, everybody can take off their coat then. Anyway, the T-CLEP tests. The T-CLEP tests don't really mimic nature very well, but as I said before, they're done often to decide whether you can dispose of this stuff in a landfill, or if you have to take it to a secure site and treat it like toxic waste. The deal is landfill leachate has a lot of organic acids in it because all the bananas and stuff that get thrown away and they're rotting and they form this sort of soupy leachate. And then in that, if you co-disposed of the slag in there, would it dissolve in it? And it turned out that the only element that we were kind of concerned with was lead here, because lead, at least one of the samples we ran did exceed the T-CLEP cutoff. In other words, based on that single analysis, this would be toxic waste. Okay, now I should say everything up till now, and I got to move along, was on fresh slag. Like, we did our best to get the actual slag and not the stuff that you see here. All this stuff that looks like bird poop is actually secondary minerals, and they're there. They form during weathering, and so we grabbed some of that stuff and put it in lab water to see how it would leach. And long story short, this is the concentration in the leachate after 1 hour contact time between water and that stuff. It is quite high zinc and quite high copper. So yeah. So conclusions from part 1 is that the fresh slag from the Butte Reduction Works, I should say, has high metal content, but overall pretty low leachability. But these secondary weathering products are a concern, and there's a lot of them actually, because the stuff's been sitting out there for 100 years. And the stuff accumulates in cracks, and then in the dry periods, these things are forming, and then in a heavy rain, you might dissolve that stuff and get a slug of metal going into the creek. So Jenna's recommendation at the end of that was, can we move Silbo Creek out of the slag walls? Well, it looks like that's going to happen, not because necessarily this study, but for whatever reason, I think there is rumors that they're going to move Silbo Creek out of the slag walls and keep the slag walls in place because they're kind of cool. Maybe put a hiking trail through them. So that's what I know. Does anyone have a question on that? before I move to the next part? Anyone else?
Mineralogy slag looks pretty unique. It's absolutely different from what you see normally around, normal rocks, right? So I think you could use that anyway as a differentiator in water quality. So you're leaching certain things out of, it's not for this site.
Oh, is there like a factor analysis?
Differentiator that you think that you could use between
Fingerprint it?
Yeah.
I don't know. Probably not if it's just copper and zinc. Maybe if there's other things that are leaching out. I don't know. I really don't think that this slag is a major issue. But again, it has copper, it has zinc stored, and that stuff is released, so maybe good to move it. There was another quick question?
Yeah, it was just about the relevance of doing the TCLP test in this environment, and so was the question, what would happen if we moved the slag to a...
Well, it wasn't, we didn't think that much about it. We just thought, well, we got to do tests. What tests are there? So we did a test, but it is relevant in a way. So, like, say, if they're excavating in the parrot tails, they hit the slag, what are they going to do with it? Well, you could take it, I suppose, and dump it in a landfill. So, based on this, you can't. Okay. Yeah, one more. Yeah.
So I'm just sort of curious, how did you get a milligram per kilogram on the precipitate? Did you scrape off the precipitate, or did you chip off part of the rock, or how did you?
You mean the secondary minerals?
Yeah.
So what we did was, if you go to the right spots, there's gobs of this stuff.
Oh,
Like guano, but it's not. It's copper sulfate.
So
and
that's all just that crusty precipitate on the...
Yeah, but some of this, I'm sure they're different precipitates.
Sure.
So these things tend to be on the underbellies of cracks and places that don't get flushed every time it rains. So. Okay, moving on to the second part. So let's look at the creek itself. This is Blacktail Creek, and this is kind of high flow here, but anyway, Blacktail Creek is actually a nice creek. There's trout in it, and it's sandy, and people have remarked that it has a lot of silt and mud in it, maybe more so than in the olden days. And we want to look at this silt and mud. This is what we're calling the fine sediment that is in the creek. It's organic rich, and turns out it's metal rich too. And we want to know about the interaction between that sediment and the river. Because if you think of the creek itself, and the banks of the creek, and underlying the creek is alluvium, sand and gravel, and there's groundwater coming in, at least in places along Blacktail Creek. There's a lot of groundwater coming in, and that groundwater has to get to the creek. It either has to go through this fine sediment on the banks in the slack water, or more likely it'll come up where those fine sediment's been scoured out, and it'll just come right up. So when you put in say a 20-foot, 30-foot monitoring well, you don't get any information on this, what's happening with this sediment. You'd be sampling the alluvium down here. So we thought this was important, so we put in a grant and it got funded. And there's a lot of microbes in that environment too. And so far I haven't hooked up, haven't collaborated with Alicia on that, but we will eventually. So we're going to use these peepers. They're about this big, don't have one. And it's acrylic, and they have all these rows of cells. And each one of these things you see is a sample cell. And you have, the peeper has three parts. It has the actual body, and in the body are these, they cut out these cells. And then you put a nylon membrane, a sheet of nylon, and then the top part that gets screwed in. And when you prepare the paper, you do it in a cooler with degassed water as much as you can, try to keep oxygen out. And the water that is at first is in all these sample cells is just lab water, deionized water. And then when you put these into the saturated sediment, the ions that are in, this is now saturated sediment, so this is a fine sediment of the creek, and there's solutes in here, and those solutes want to diffuse across the membrane into the little cell. Now there's nothing here, so there's not much happening going that way. So it just, the solutes equilibrate across the membrane until the composition here is the same as here. And then when you pull these suckers out, you've got 28, this is about roughly a centimeter as you go down. So you got 28 centimeters with lots of data points to look at fine scale gradients in the metals. The actual membrane has a 5 micron pore size. 5 microns, not your typical like 0.45 microns. And that's to have faster equilibration times. Well, if it's 5 microns, then you know, bacteria and solutes can, suspended sediment can cross in a membrane. And that's okay, because that stuff's out here anyway. So it can cross in there. But what it means is that when you sample these things, you got to filter them to get that stuff out of there. And we had a lot of experience using these in Warm Springs Ponds and Georgetown Lake. So there's Bob putting in one in the wintertime. And I guess that's me putting one in somewhere else, Slag Canyon somewhere. And they're easy to deploy. As long as you have fine grain sediment, it basically goes in like this. All right. All right. But if it's gravel, it won't go in. So you got to find the fine sediment. All right. Now we did this, and Bob really liked the Peeper stuff, and so that son of a gun wound up doing a lot, and then we did a lot when he was gone, and even as recently as last week we sampled a Peeper, or we're going to sample, I guess, Friday, way up in the Roosevelt Drive area. So the thing is that you see a cluster here in the Slag Canyon. You see pretty good spacing here. This is Blacktail Creek. We also put some in these ponds. It's a big pond here, and there's a pond over here. And but then there's a gap, and those gaps are there because the stream sediment's too coarse. We weren't able to put the Peepers in, install them there. Each of these Peepers, we make a plan, and so when we sample them, there's 28 rows, and then there's 2 columns. On some of them, half the cells have an A and a B side. And so we make a plan like, okay, first thing we do is we're gonna do every odd numbered one for stick a needle in there, suck it up into a syringe, put a filter on, push it through. Then maybe we're interested in H2S, hydrogen sulfide, phosphate, yada yada. So we kind of go through. And these are the more reactive ones, or the more critical data, we get that first. And then the stuff we don't really care about as much, we wait till the end. That takes about an hour to do that. It is possible, people always ask, can you get pH and EH? Yes, you can. We've done it in the past, but it requires microelectrodes that are expensive, that break easily, and are very slow to equilibrate, and it slows down the sampling so much that we felt in most times better to forget about it and just get the metals data. So other things we would do, like alkalinity, determination, soluble reactive phosphate, ammonium. Samples, filtered samples would go to the Bureau for ICP, mass spec, and IC. The sol is that we did collect some solid cores, and these would be dried and sieved and then analyzed by X-ray diffraction and XRF. So it was a lot of data for Bob to put together. And this first slide, just to show you that fine grain sediment is high in metals. So This is average US stream sediment. And then some data for 3 of our peepers, lead, arsenic, zinc, copper, all roughly 10 times higher than average stream. So definitely not just fine-grained sediment that got washed down from Roosevelt Drive. There's something going on there. If we do the mineralogy, I'll skip this stuff on the right. This is 8 or 10 different samples, and then we ran an X-ray diffraction on it, and then they're just stacked here. But there are 8 different analyses stacked. And the upshot was, when you pull the core out, this top part, which is all black because of its organic rich, we think that is relatively new stream sediment washed down from upstream. The constituents are basically granite, quartz, feldspar, and muscovite. This stuff down here, though, is mill tailings, we think, because it contained like 5 or 8% pyrite and did not have any feldspar in it, for whatever. Mill tailings didn't usually have feldspar in it. And there was this cool sort of reaction zone in between where calcite happened to be precipitating. Some of this is just sort of to give people in the audience an idea of what can be done. And pretty cheap, too, because this didn't cost anything, except for Bob. Time. Some more data. This is the mouth of Blacktail Creek, just near the USGS gauging station, which I understand is being moved. And so all of these you see, when we put the peeper in, there's a couple rows that we leave that are in the water itself of the stream. And so we want to capture that stream water. And then here's the interface. And then now we're going down in depth. And this is a logarithmic scale. So we're showing you iron and manganese, dissolved iron and dissolved manganese. And they go way up. Iron goes to 100 ppm. And this is only about 10 centimeters, or roughly that much, into the sediment. And then manganese goes way up. So you can bet there's going to be some upwards diffusion, right, of those solutes into the stream. Can't stop that. Solutes will diffuse from high concentration to low concentration. They'll be wanting to go up into the stream. Let me add, and when they do that, and they hit the oxygenated water in the stream, some of the iron forms iron oxides, and we see that in the core, and also in our peepers. We see iron oxide layer right at that boundary. So if I add now arsenic, one of the worst of the contaminants in the creek, we see arsenic concentrations also go way up to about 100 parts per billion in this one. This isn't really the most contaminated site either. This is just on Blacktail Creek, but 100 ppb, 10 times drinking water standard. And you can see this sort of how the arsenic pattern, iron and manganese all follow the same pattern. And you can, although we didn't, you can do speciation, decide whether it's arsenic 3 or arsenic plus 5. We think it's a mix. And I'm throwing in phosphorus because another thing that happens in creeks is you get too many nutrients sometimes, too many nutrients. And phosphorus is a limiting nutrient that can make algae blooms. So it's an interesting thing. We can measure it, and it's really high. So over 1 milligram per liter in the 6 inches into the sediment. And so that should be diffusing up as well into the creek. All right. I'm going to skip that. I'll just say that iron, manganese, phosphorus, arsenic, all tracking together because iron oxides will absorb arsenic and phosphorus. They both like to stick to iron oxides. Well, if you bury the iron oxides in that carbon sediment, they will dissolve. Microbes will actually dissolve them, release the iron, release the arsenic and the phosphorus back in the solution. Okay. Now these ponds are of interest we thought, because they're going to build new ones, probably some big ones upstream, and these ponds already exist. And so, I don't know, we just went in there and paddled around the kayak, put in some piezometers and peepers and sampled them. And sure enough, they show the same thing. So arsenic, 400 ppb, high iron, 10 ppm, high manganese, in the sediment pore water of these ponds. And by the way, this little pond here, which is near the walking trail, had high arsenic in the pond water. It was over 10 ppb. So that's food for thought as we build more ponds. This diffusion out of the sediment can load up, can be a source of arsenic. Okay. Wicked high numbers. Arsenic here is 3,000 ppb. Iron is 600,000 ppb. This stuff is 600 ppm. This stuff is almost as iron-rich as the Berkeley pit was back when it was red. And this is in the sediment pore water of the fine-grained sediment in the Slag Canyon. All right, got to move on. One reason the sediment is black is because it's full of organic carbon. Another reason is because there's sulfide in the sediment. And if you spend any time in that muck, like I do fishing or whatever, and you get it on your waders or you get it on your hands and smell it, you can smell the sulfide even though it's present at low concentrations. So that's happening from bacteria. Now these bacteria produce H2S, and these are actual Peeper profiles showing sulfate concentrations getting drawn down as into the depth into the sediment by these little microbes that are producing H2S. The H2S will immediately react with any copper or zinc and form zinc and copper sulfides. And so we think that's the main reason why we never see any copper or zinc in the pore water of the Peepers, because they get knocked down by the H2S. All right. So this is funny because if you drive to Missoula, you're probably going to stop in Beer Lodge to get a Diet Coke at Fix truck stop. And I went in there and said, "Do you know that there's Foss Law of Diffusion?" And the lady said, "No." I said, "Well, don't I get an award for pointing that out?" And he said, "No." But then she smiles. But anyway, Foss Law just says that solutes will go from high concentration to low concentration. They will diffuse slowly, turns out, from high concentration to low. So Bob ran the calculations to see if that's important. So how much we have the gradients. I mean, the flux here, this flux here, J, is proportional to the concentration gradient, dC dZ. We know what the concentration gradient is. These are just constants that you can make up or read the literature. So anyway, long story short here, because it is complex, we don't think that the diffusion is really impacting the stream very much, because the stream moves through LAO within probably less than a day, and diffusion is slow. So this here is showing the change in arsenic concentration due to upwards diffusion from the sediment. 0.001 ppb, 0.001 ppb increase. That's nothing really. So because the water's moving through pretty quick, we don't think that this process is all that important. That's good news, I guess. It's not really the case, though, in the ponds, because in the ponds the water's just sitting there. And you have this diffusion upwards into the ponds that don't, by the way, have surface water coming in or out. Some of them don't. Some of them do, some of them don't. The arsenic can accumulate over time. So, so our conceptual model, I guess, is we think, and somebody asked me this question, where does this fine sediment pick up the metals? I kind of think most of it is coming from the contaminated groundwater coming in, but some of it might be airborne material that gets into the watershed and flushed into the Blacktail Creek. Some of it might be from the creek itself going this way, I don't know, but there's metal in it. But the contaminated groundwater can go directly into the creek, and that's where most of the advection is, where it's sandy. But where this fine sediment is, any metal that gets in there gets stored. It gets stored in the sediment as sulfides or oxides or carbonates or something like that. Now the creek level goes up and down. So when the creek dries out in the summertime, some of this fine sediment is exposed. It can oxidize and release some metals. That's a concern. And the other thing that happens is every year we have storms, and the storms rip up that fine sediment, which is all nicely layered, and a lot of this fine-grained metal sulfide gets suspended and oxidizes and is released. So our conclusions: there is a lot of fine sediment along the creek. It is metal rich, not like ripping metal rich, but pretty high. And the metal is in these oxides and sulfide minerals, also probably some carbonate minerals. The sediment pore water that you're looking at here, 6 inches into that mucky stuff, has very high concentrations of dissolved iron, manganese, and arsenic, but not copper and zinc or lead. And diffusion up out of that stuff is probably, you can't stop it, but it's too slow to have an impact on the creek. This isn't the case for the ponds, which could have retention times of like years. And this metal-rich sediment gets, on average, it forms and then it gets resuspended and swept downstream during high flow. And the particles then will be dispersed down gradient. Some of them will re-dissolve. Food for thought, and I'm not saying this should be done, but it's possible, technically possible to make an artificial reservoir somewhere, maybe down towards Rocker, that could capture this fine sediment that will settle out. I don't know. Maybe it's not even technically feasible, because when the river is booking, nothing's settling out. It's just whipping up. It's picking up those fine-grained sediment, and it's going to all wind up down in Warm Springs Ponds, which brings up the next thing, is that Warm Springs Ponds is still, and there's a lot of debate now about what to do with Warm Springs Ponds now that the creek is what do you call, cleaned up. But Warm Springs Ponds, so, you know, should we decommission them and bury them or take them away? The Warm Springs Pond still does a very important thing. It captures the high suspended load when the spring snow melt comes, and when we get a summer thunderstorm, and all this stuff gets suspended and goes into the ponds. Ponds are taking that stuff out, so that's important. And that's it. Any questions? We're all hot.